With that, I'd like to introduce David Rogers, who is well, David, tell us what it is you do.
Well, right now I'm transitioning positions. Right now I am the training director for the National Native Center of Excellence, which is housed in the Lighthouse Institute, which is the research branch of Chestnut Health Systems. And in that position, I'm working with tribes on programs like the Basic Tribal Probation Academy, teaching tribal probation officers the basic skill sets for that, but including programming and understanding of working with clients who are addicted, suffering from addiction issues, mental health issues, going through recovery, how to work with that clientele.
Okay.
But within the next 30 days, I'll be transitioning over to a new company called Justice and Security Strategies. They are a government contractor that provides services for all public safety, but including tribal public safety. And so I'll be leading the violent crime reduction grant program with them, and bringing along with me the Tribal Probation Academy and the National Native Youth Justice Academy.
I know from our prior discussion that you had an interesting and varied career, and while I know you've gone over it with me, I'd like you to do it again, starting with your experience in high school.
Well, I was destined, I think, to be a farmer, a rancher, but I took a position with Nez Perce National Historical Park, which is a national park within the boundaries of my tribal reservation, which is the Nez Perce Indian Reservation.
That's in Idaho?
Yes, that's in Idaho. And in that position, I had a park superintendent who took a special interest in me, and he had me read a lot, and then he put me out with the public, and I was answering questions and telling stories about the Nez Perce tribe and the missionaries and Lewis and Clark and the whole show. And in one of my audiences, and I was only 17 at the time that I was doing this, and there was a gentleman in the audience who kept asking these same questions, and I'd answer him just like I'd never heard the question before, which is how they teach you to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And later I get called into the superintendent's office, and I thought I'd gotten into trouble, which is usually when you get called into the superintendent's office. And that gentleman was sitting there, and I thought, oh gosh, what did I do? Well, it turned out he worked for the State Department, and he asked if I would be interested in traveling to the UK and doing those presentations to students in the United Kingdom through the embassy, State Department at the embassy in London. And of course, that intrigued me, and it actually redirected me from a lot of other things that I had planned. And so I went to the UK. I spent about 1.5 years there and traveled all over the United Kingdom doing presentations to schools and to museums. The American Museum in Bath gave me a residency. Actually, after that, I spent some time basically having a static display and presentations at the American Museum. And that really...
It sounds like you had a really wonderful time.
Yeah, it was a great time. Met a lot of amazing people, and that's really what got me going with basically public speaking. And I still do a lot of public speaking to this day. Voice is a little bit more crackly than it used to be, but that's where this is mine. So when I came back to the U.S., I went to college, but while I was in college, I became distracted with during my summer job back with the National Park Service with a state trooper who would stop by and take his breaks, and we became friends. And then he asked if I wanted to go out and ride patrol with him, and I did. And I became hooked on policing. Something different every day. They're out there helping people, and some of those areas in Idaho, very dangerous to drive, and going to accidents and such. And at the time, the Idaho State University was working on an experimental police academy that was 11 months long. Most of the police academies back in that time were, 6 weeks long. There wasn't very much time to be trained to be a police officer. So they were working on a more extensive training program. And so the trooper sponsored me, and I went to that police academy, spent 11 months at Idaho State University, and came out with that law enforcement certificate. and started a career in policing. So I've worked with both tribal, non-tribal agencies. I've been a police chief for tribal and non-tribal agencies. And then a point came to where I was offered a position with the Western Community Policing Institute, running their Indian Country training initiatives for the COPS office, Department of Justice. So I did that for them for 3 years, then got recruited away to Fox Valley Technical College, where I continued that work for a decade. And during that time, created programs such as the Tribal Probation Academy, the National Indian Youth Justice Academy. And I left there to go back to my own tribe, and I police chief for them for 2.5 years to help build their police department, which we did, and left them with a good department, having some challenges now though. But from there, I was appointed to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the state of Washington, both the Eastern and Western districts, as the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Coordinator. So I became very involved in MMIP work, and I still do. I'm still developing training and technical assistance for tribes to address the MMIP issues. And then I came to where I'm at now. From there, I came to NNCOE and then transitioning over to JSS. So all of that work, the academies and the MMIP program, is all going to come over to JSS.
So as I said earlier, you started out as an educator, you became a police officer and then a police chief, and now have gone back to being an educator with a law enforcement component. Am I correct?
Yeah, I look at it more as a public safety component, because we do work with probation and probation academy. Tribal probation officers have no access to any kind of a certification. There is no federal certification. They don't fit into the state programs. So when I was at Fox Valley, I created the Tribal Probation Academy. And so since I've been with NNCOE, we've ran 2 academies at height. I get emails all the time asking to run that academy. So we do in-person 3-week trainings for them to get certified. And we're working on getting a national certification set up for that. So they do have a national cert that they can rely on. The Youth Academy was created back when I was the chief of police of the Makah Nation in Washington State. I could not recruit Native folks to become police officers. It was not a popular career path. And yet tribal community members weren't really happy that you hire outsiders to come in and police. So the idea came to me that we would have to really recruit young Native people when they're in junior high to convince them to walk a certain path if they want to become police officers for their community. You can't have the DUI or the DV or anything on your record in order to be a police officer. And we thought we'd create that interest. So we created that program, basically a Citizens Police Academy for Native American youth. And we held 7 of those. And we had 450 kids go through that program.
Wow.
When I left Fox Valley, it pretty much died. And so again, I get lots of requests to reinstitute that. So now we are. And so we're planning on holding our first new program. And we retitled it to the National Indian Youth Justice Academy because we're including other components such as judges, prosecutors, defense, probation, corrections, victim services, all of those components that are in the public safety realm to introduce Native youth to all of those career paths.
That's interesting. And maybe if you can send me a link to that, I can post it on the description of this so that people can find it and maybe help you get some more people to come.
We actually just had a video. We had a professional video made. I can send that to you too. And
please do.
A short 9-minute video that explains what we're doing with that program.
Okay, and you're moving then to this new position so you can enhance your training ability. Is that right?
Yes, JSS has resources that can help me get these programs off the ground. I try to do trainings and programs that do not cost the tribes, an arm and a leg. I try to provide training that's available to everybody in Indian country. And so, it's JSS has the resources and that I need to get these programs going.
Okay, and I'd like to turn now from that into a discussion about tribal sovereignty and tribal courts. I don't think these concepts are really well understood by the vast majority of Americans. So let me start by asking you, could you sort of describe what tribal sovereignty means as you understand?
Well, sovereignty of any nation means that you self-govern your nation, you self-govern your people. And I believe you're correct. I think the vast majority of Americans don't understand the concept of why tribes are called sovereign nations. And it often creates a lot of debate and some conflict, and especially when it comes to casinos. Why can the tribes do that? Why are they allowed to do this and we can't, and so on and so forth. And but the tribes were recognized as sovereign nations by the early European nations that were coming to North America, in that treaties were signed and agreements were made by government to government, from European nations to tribal nations, wherever things were happening. And when the US government was created after the Revolutionary War, the tribes were recognized as sovereign in the Articles of Confederation and then in the Constitution of the United States. And then the US government entered into treaty negotiations with tribes into the mid to late 1800s. And treaties are agreements that are written between government to government. And so the continual recognition of tribes as sovereign nations continued. Now, of course, in US involvement with the tribes, their relationship kind of swings back and forth on a pendulum. Yep. And there were times where they tried to eliminate all that, and they'd probably regretted signing a lot of those treaties. But the treaties had stayed intact, and even though there were tribes that were terminated, now they're being reestablished, and all federal policies that go back and forth. But the sovereign status has been challenged a number of times, and they've been upheld by the Supreme Court in a series of decisions that recognize that the tribes are sovereign nations, but they are in a ward relationship with the federal government. So the federal government does have some limits on it. I mean, the federal government does have say on a lot of things that take place within Indian country, but the tribes do have that right and privilege to govern themselves. And so based on a lot of the prior Supreme Court decisions that kind of define the role between tribes, self-governance and federal involvement, are out there, and that's what the tribes rely on when they have a challenge. And the biggest challenge with tribes, of course, are when the states try to interfere in tribal government. And throughout history, it's been emphasized that the relationship is between central government, the federal government, and the tribes, not the state and the tribes.
And I'm going to come to that now, because that leads us to a discussion of McGirt versus Oklahoma, which is the most recent, and his prodigy are the most recent decisions with regard to tribal sovereignty, which, as I understand it, basically said that states have no role in crimes that are committed on tribal lands. Is that correct?
Prior to PL 280, yes. Prior to PL 280, the states had no jurisdiction. It was the tribes have jurisdiction over their own people based on Crow Dog ex parte case. And then because of Crow Dog ex parte, that case was taken. The federal government did not like that the tribes had jurisdiction over major crimes. And so the Major Crimes Act was passed, and that handed over major crimes over to the federal government. So
major crimes, it would be fair to characterize them as felonies?
Yeah, the major felony crimes.
All right.
And so as time evolved, ultimately today, the FBI have jurisdiction over felony crimes in the country, and they're prosecuted in the federal courts. However, the federal court sometimes will decline a prosecution, or the FBI will decline to submit a case to the U.S. District Court. So it'll be sent back to the tribes, and then the tribes will then prosecute those cases, which originally were felonies, back in tribal court as misdemeanors.
Okay, but
so they really are handling felony cases. They just have been reclassified back down to a misdemeanor level.
Oh, that's interesting. I want to come to tribal courts, but I want to finish McGirt.
Okay.
Basically, as I understand it, Oklahoma was trying to enforce its laws on tribal lands. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, they didn't think it was tribal lands. They thought they had jurisdiction.
Right. And the Supreme Court basically said these are tribal lands and Oklahoma has no jurisdiction. No state has jurisdiction over tribal lands. Is that a correct understanding of that decision?
Yeah, again, with the exception of PL 280, the McGirt decision came out because they thought that the reservations had been de-established. And so they were operating under the assumption that that was all state land. And then what happened was it was found that the Congress had not signed those actions, and therefore the reservations had not been terminated. So those boundaries were still there. That meant that all those cases that had been prosecuted in state court should have been prosecuted in either tribal or federal court based on what the offense would have been.
You know if that decision led to an increase in the number of cases being heard by tribal courts?
In Oklahoma, definitely. And in fact, the U.S. District, the U.S. Attorney's Office has been swamped too. They've had to detail, assistant U.S. attorneys down there to kind of start doing all the research and figuring out where all the federal cases need to go and how far back are they reaching and all that. Yeah, it created a huge conundrum down there in terms of what's going on. And of course, the state of Oklahoma is extremely unhappy with all of it.
But I personally think that it was correctly decided in the sense that, in some sense, a person who is born on tribal lands with Native heritage has dual citizenship, that of the tribe and of the United States.
Yeah, it was in the mid to late 20s. I'm going to take a shot here. I know the date, but it's slipping my mind. But tribal members were not citizens of the United States until the 1920s, and then in the 1920s they were given 1924 they were given U.S. citizenship. That's when the dual citizenship part kind of began. Okay. A lot of that was a result of, in a way, it was kind of a thanks to all the Native people who served the U.S. military in World War I. The Native Americans have had the highest volunteer rate for military service than any other ethnicity in the nation. And so even when they weren't citizens of the country, they were serving in the U.S. military. So in 24, they did get that citizenship. So now they're functioning under dual citizenship.
Let's turn to tribal courts. You said that it would be a fair description, I think, from your earlier statements that they're limited jurisdiction courts. They don't hear felonies, but they do hear what are classified as misdemeanors, even if some of them are really felonies. Is that right?
Yeah, it's complicated in the sense that tribes, tribal courts, and especially tribal probation, even tribal policing, historically are fairly new. I mean, given the spectrum of how long courts have been in the United States and policing has been in the United States, Indian country has done this growth in a relatively short period of time. And so tribal courts that had been established, I mean, back in the Indian agent days, the Indian agent was the judge, and the Indian agent was the person that would hear any kind of a crime, and it was not representative of the tribes, whatsoever. And so when the Indian Reorganization Act took place, the Indian Reorganization Act, again, I mentioned that pendulum, federal policy going back and forth.
Yep.
They went through the policy where they were trying to terminate the tribes and get rid of the tribes and all that stuff. And then the reorganization, IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, was created, and that encouraged the tribes to establish their own courts. And it put an emphasis on self-governments and the establishment of tribal councils and elected officials to represent the people within the tribe. And so under the Indian Reorganization Act, we started to see tribal courts develop and get away from the Code of Federal CFR courts and these Indian agent courts and all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And so they started off with tribal courts, and the policing switched from Indian agent police officers or military types of law enforcement to tribes selecting and having tribal members do policing. primitive type of policing, as it were. They weren't super well equipped, and they didn't really have the training in that type of thing. My grandfather, in fact, was the sole liquor suppression agent for the government on the Nez Reservation for a while. I have his badge and his hat and his identification. My brother
That's
has
cool.
his full peacemaker and rifle. And but anyway, it was a tough job to do that type of thing. And so eventually tribal law enforcement began to get established. And then even more recently, tribal probation has come into being. And so the process has been kind of slow. But then that pendulum swings again, and you end up with Public Law 280 being established. And Public Law 280 was the federal government saying, you know, we're done doing felony crimes in Indian country. We're walking away from it. So the federal authority on felony jurisdiction leaves, and it's handed over to the states. It's handed over to the counties. And this is without any consultation with the tribes, and actually no consultation with the states, really. Kind of a surprise to them. It was an unfunded mandate. And so now all of a sudden you have the state has jurisdiction on the tribal lands. We still, of course, have PL 280 tribes. California is a PL 280 state. Alaska is a PL 280 state. My tribe opted into PL 280. They didn't have to, but one council decided to do that. It created a huge headache. And so the only way those tribes get out of that is to go through retrocession. And they have to petition the governor of the state. They want to have their the federal jurisdiction returned. When that happens, then the feds will come back and assume jurisdiction over major crimes. The tribes will assume their authority over tribal code and misdemeanor statutes. And the state can and sometimes does still maintain a concurrent jurisdiction. But agreements need to be made to so everybody's not stepping on each other's toes. It is a mess.
So let's talk about what type of crimes do the tribal courts see?
Well, they see all misdemeanor types crimes. And of course, when I first started doing work specifically with tribes, we noticed that a lot of tribal codes were very antiquated. They hadn't been changed in a very long time. Sometimes they would take a criminal code and adopt it from some other location and
Right.
write their name in it. So code development, policy development has been a big thing over the last 20 years, where tribes are updating and adopting their own, where the tribal legislation is passing laws that are applicable to the tribe. And so the tribal court can hear civil cases, tribal civil cases. They can hear non-felony cases in their court. But that, in a way, that's not a good, accurate depiction, because if a felony case does get referred up through the feds, but it gets declined, it comes back to the tribe, and the tribe has to prosecute it as a felony, or as a misdemeanor, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And as a result of that, the Tribal Law and Order Act did pass a component to it. If a tribe meets the criteria, they can sentence somebody up to 3 years in a misdemeanor for jail. That's to kind of make up that difference. So these cases have come from federal court, and they're more serious than your standard.
That's a felony sentence.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. All right, but it strikes me that there's from what my reading suggests to me, that there's a restorative justice component to the tribal courts that doesn't exist largely in state courts in the United States. Am I correct in that?
Well, I will say that restorative justice concepts originated with Indian country. I mean, that's
my understanding.
The Crow Dog ex parte case, that was the first, I think, officially recognized restorative justice component. The territory of Dakota wanted to hang tribal member who committed murder against another tribal member. That was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and when that case was handed back, they said tribes have jurisdiction over their own people, and that the territory didn't have jurisdiction in that case. The tribe didn't want to execute the offender. They wanted him to give back to the family he took from, to replace the man he killed, provide protection, provide food, and the tribe had a penalty that in horses that had to be done, and so on and so forth. Well, the federal government didn't like that. I mean, you don't, they didn't like that restorative justice concept. They're used to hanging folk. And so the Major Crimes Act was passed, and the feds took over authority of major crimes occurring in Indian country. One of those unique cases where you go to the Supreme Court and win, and then you come back and then they pass a law that takes your win away from you.
Yep.
And so we still live that way today. The Major Crimes Act is still in place today. So the FBI primarily have jurisdiction.
But I think in the courts, the tribal courts themselves, you guys do this sort of, the courts really focus on restorative practices. Is that right? I mean, making the people who were the victims of crimes whole and getting the perpetrator involved in a way that restores them too.
Yeah, it's it's going to vary. I mean, there's hundreds of tribal courts, and they all operate under their own philosophies.
Right.
But restorative justice is a big part of that. Peacemaking is a big part of that. In fact, in our next probation academy class, I have a peacemaker judge who's going to come over and put them through a circle. And he also appears in my video on the youth academy, and he talks about tribal courts don't look for right or wrong. They look for resolution.
Right.
And it's mediation, and it's peacemaking.
That's a fair way of describing restorative practices is peacemaking, isn't it?
Right. And so all the things that come out of that, sentencing circles, elder courts, youth courts, healing to wellness courts, drug courts, all of that, all had their originations in the restorative justice movement. And if you went to restorative justice conferences back then, they did give credit to the tribes for being the ones that actually practiced that. And so a lot of non-tribal courts have picked up on that too, and they're practicing those concepts as well.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that the American criminal justice community is learning from the tribal courts, where this whole concept of restorative justice, which I encountered, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, actually wasn't being practiced in American state courts, but it was being practiced even then in tribal communities. And I think it's huge because the stats that I see on it suggest that it's very effective.
Yeah, I look at some of the recidivism statistics coming out of tribal courts, and it's actually pretty impressive.
Yeah.
You would think that some things like alcohol addiction would be a lost cause sort of a thing, but it's surprising that combined with the court using restorative justice concepts, probation following those concepts and referring clients to restorative programs, that the recidivism rate is surprisingly drastically reduced in a lot of tribal communities.
Yeah, and I think if I understand you correctly, this is being taught in your academy and other places to people who are in charge of community supervision in tribal lands. Is that correct?
Yeah, my program spends a lot of time on restorative justice concepts and evidence-based practices that work. The other thing we do is, and the National Native Center, Native Center of Excellence does the same thing, is we really emphasize that tribes have every right to look at practices and things that they do traditionally in their traditional ways to apply that to working with people who are struggling. And you don't have to, there are Western ways of doing things, but there's indigenous ways of doing things. And not to negate or to not look at or explore using indigenous concepts for treatment and resolution and healing and all of that. Apply it as you can. And because some tribes are very limited on resources, when we talk, for example, about treatment care for sex offenders, very, very tough population to work with, and people who are sex offender treatment providers, they're few and far between, and they're mostly located in the cities.
Right.
If you have somebody on your caseload who is a sex offender and you're located in a really rural, remote area, those resources aren't there. but you got to do something. And taking a look at traditional indigenous ways is something to reach for if you've got access to that.
Would you say that the restorative practices are at the core of what are called wellness courts?
They would be part of that. Yeah, those concepts are all fit in together.
Okay. And that essentially, as I understand wellness courts, they take the drug court model and they apply it within the context of the philosophies that the tribal leadership or the tribal courts have. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly it.
Okay. What would you think are the most significant problems impacting on tribal courts today?
Well, on tribal courts, it's going to be caseloads. It's going to be the docket. When the cops office funded tribal police agencies and they hired a lot more officers, they didn't increase the capacity of the courts or probation or anybody else for that matter. And so you ended up having more cases coming into the tribal courts. The other thing is better training and better investigative techniques and partnerships. I know that when I was chief of my own tribe, we had a great relationship with the FBI, the BIA, the DEA,
Yep.
U.S. Forest Service, all our federal partners. We did not have such a great relationship with our county sheriff's departments.
Okay.
We had a good relationship with the state police. And so when you work together, when you put a team together that's going to go out and do drug interdiction
Right.
programs, well, a lot of that's going to go felony. A lot of it's also going to go into the tribal court as well. So they get impacted by enforcement activity that generates arrests or citations into the court. And sometimes your tribal judge is maybe by themselves. So they're handling criminal and civil cases, or maybe handling adult and juvenile cases.
Wow.
So they kind of have to carry the whole caseload.
That's a
the bigger
complicated
tribes,
job then.
yeah, and the bigger tribes, they have the staff to handle the separate types of cases. So yeah, I would say caseload is their biggest challenge, but they're also facing new kinds of crimes. I mean, drugs are hitting the entire country hard. The Indian country is hit especially hard. Meth is still a big drug problem in Indian country. And yeah, fentanyl's around, but we still have a big meth problem. It has never gone away.
All right.
And so handling those kinds of cases rolling through the docket is difficult. So, and every new kind of crime that comes through, I mean, computer crimes are a new thing, relatively a new thing. And as tribal investigators get trained in those areas, then more investigations and more charges can come through. So it's a real delicate balancing act that the courts have to face.
So where do you see tribal justice going in the future?
Well, I hope that balance can be reached. Indian country is historically understaffed for enforcement services and protection. Tribal courts tend to be understaffed, and as are the probation departments. So all of that. The other thing that's really important to me is our victim services and our treatment providers. They seem to be always scraping the bone for those folks, and they don't have the resources to provide the services to victims and to individuals that need help. Yeah, it's expensive. I mean, and justice is expensive.
Yeah.
There's no getting around that, and so hopefully ways are found to and there has. I'm not saying that the federal government hasn't provided a lot of funding into a lot of these programs, at least policing and the judicial side. But the treatment and the victim services and the probation side are horribly underfunded. And for everything to work, or at least to work at the best level that they can, they all need to be in tune and capable of functioning with each other. And so it's always a little bit lopsided, either on the law enforcement or the court side compared to the service providers.
Wow. Listen, with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us on Justice Speak, David. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate it, and I look forward to chatting with you again.
I thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share information. The more awareness that we can create, the better, I do believe.
Once again, thank you for joining us on Justice Speaks.